Good day. Today is Saturday, 9th November, and prior to discussing the situation in Ukraine and the latest maneuvers involving President Donald Trump, I'm going to return to the topic of the recent Israeli missile strike on Iran, the one which took place on the 26th of October. And the reason I'm doing that is because in his very latest video, Brian Beletic, out the new Atlas, did what I think is the single most thorough and complete analysis of that attack that I have seen up to this time. Bear in mind, he served in the military. I appreciate he's perhaps not the sort of person that he didn't serve in the sort of departments of the military which maybe are involved in post-missile strike analysis and that kind of thing. I don't fully know what part of the military he did serve in, other than that it was in the Marine Corps. But one thing I have discovered, and it's become absolutely clear to me over the last 3 years, is that service in the military does provide one with a toolkit, an ability to understand and assess military strikes far more effectively than someone who's not had the same kind of involvement in the military, such as me. I suffice to say, I lack those sort of skills. Anyway, what Brian Beletic has done is he's looked at the missile strike. He's looked at the various photographs, the various satellite photographs that have been provided. He's made the point that the satellite photos that have been provided do not actually support some of the claims which have been made in Israel and in the United States and in the media in Europe and in Britain about the extent of the strikes, the successful extent of the strikes which we've been told about. One photograph, one satellite photograph, which he produced, which he showed on his program, doesn't seem, or at least he wasn't able to see, any clear evidence of damage on the facility that had supposedly been attacked at all. I've seen the same photograph, and I'd come to the same conclusion, but as I've said many times, my vision is poor. And beyond that, I'm not able to carry out any kind of proper assessment. It was always possible that I'd looked at a photograph and had not been able to see something, even though it was there. But he doesn't seem to think that there is any evidence of any significant damage assessment, of any damage shown in this picture, in this photograph. Other photographs, I think there's two others, do show damage. One shows extensive damage to one building, but, well, to say it frankly, that doesn't seem to me to correspond with some of the wilder claims, the bigger claims of massive damage to Iran's capacity to produce and manufacture missiles, which is supposed to have been what a lot of the claims spoke about. And, well, there have been claims about attacks on Iran's air defense system. There's a photograph that has appeared of an attack on a Hawk air defense missile base, and that looks as if it's true. But this is a rather old system, as I've discussed in previous programs. There have also been multiple claims in the media in Britain and in the United States and in Israel as well, that as many as 4 S-300 missile systems have been destroyed. Brian Beletic takes the view that that is unlikely, that this is a large and complex system, almost certainly heavily dispersed. Each system would be dispersed. Perhaps certain component parts of individual S-300 systems were destroyed, but there is really no evidence, one way or the other, to support to support even those claims. So overall, based on the information that we have, the attack may not have been quite as effective as some of the media reports may be suggesting. Now, I do accept, and I think Brian would say the same, that we're getting a very incomplete picture of the information about the attack. But again, I ask the question, if the damage had been as extensive as we have been told, why is there so little corroborating information provided publicly to confirm it? I remember, for example, during the war between the United States and Iraq back in 1990, 1991, that the Western powers provided us with a huge amount of evidence of how successful they were in attacking and destroying Iraqi military installations. So why are we getting so much less this time? I mean, one can come up with explanations, but I'm not going to waste time doing that. The simplest explanation, the most obvious one, is we are not being provided with that information because it doesn't exist, because the damage done was not so extensive after all. Well, there might be, as I said, other explanations, but it seems to me that the burden falls on those who claim that the strike was effective to provide them. And up to now, to be frank, I haven't seen them do so. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. Now, all of that talks about the assessment of the actual information of the strike itself. But that was not the most interesting part of Brian Beletic's commentary. The most interesting part for me was his discussion of the incredibly complicated and carefully organized and lengthily prepared nature of this Israeli strike. It required aircraft to fly, take off, launch missiles from the airspace of various neighboring countries. Brian Beletic is skeptical that the Israelis actually launched their strikes from Syrian airspace. He suggests that, in fact, it was more likely that the attack was conducted from Jordanian airspace, and that the Israelis and the Western powers and the Jordanians themselves don't want that fact to be publicized, which is why it's spoken of as if the attack was launched from Syrian airspace. That may very well be true, by the way, but we'll skip that. The point is that this strike required lots of aircraft to be used. It required them to operate over the airspace of other countries. Perhaps around 50 missiles were launched. It's the point he's making, and I think it is a valid point, is that what the strike shows, the difficulties, the complexity of the strike shows, is that it would be extremely difficult for Israel, without the active involvement of the United States, to sustain a major air offensive against Iran. The Israelis, for the moment at least, are reluctant to send their aircraft closer to Iran. They might also have to face the problem that other countries, Arab countries, whose airspace they would have to overfly, might not be keen to let them do so. And the result is that large numbers of aircraft had to be used, missiles had to be launched from a significant distance, and the number of missiles, nonetheless, was significantly below the number of missiles that the Iranians used in their strike against Israel. So that's Brian Beletic's assessment. And frankly, I can't see any essential flaws in this. We have stories that F-35 stealth fighter jets did penetrate Iranian airspace. The Iranians have categorically denied that. Again, there's no real proof of this one way or the other. What we do know about the strike was that it was conducted from a distance with a limited number of missiles, but with a large number of aircraft, apparently. And as Brian Beletic says, by definition, it is going to be more difficult to conduct a missile campaign, an air campaign, against Iran, this huge country, using air-launched missiles launched from aircraft from a distance, than it is for the Iranians to conduct a missile campaign against Israel using ground-launched missiles. Now, of course, there are other factors at play. There's claims that the Iranians significantly reduced their stockpile of missiles that are capable of reaching Israel, from Iranian territory over the course of their missile strike on the 1st of October. That might be true, but then we don't know that for a fact because, as far as I can tell, nobody really seems to know exactly how many missiles the Iranians actually have. There's claims that they're down to just 400 missiles. That might be true. Long-range, precision-guided missiles capable of reaching Israel. That might be true. But then I've heard so many stories about how limited Russian missile stockpiles are. I remember reading an article in the Daily Telegraph in March 2022 that the Russians were about to run out of cruise missiles because Russian cruise missiles depended on Ukrainian engines, and without supplies of engines from Ukraine, the Russians no longer had missiles that they could launch at Israel. So there were lots of claims of that kind circulating then, and repeatedly, ever afterwards, we've had claim after claim that the Russians were on the brink of running out of missiles and that their stockpiles of missiles had been exhausted. And, well, we've seen that the Russians have not run out of missiles. In fact, their missile offensives against Ukraine have steadily increased in power and scope. And given that history, I'm not frankly prepared to make any assumptions about Iranian stockpiles of missiles and Iranian capabilities in missiles. And of course, with Iranian air defenses, it's the same story. I've heard completely contrasting opinions about these. Some say that they are very effective. Others say that they're partially effective. Others say that they're completely ineffective. But the point is that the Iranians do have an air defense system, and it did shoot down some Israeli missiles. I think it's fairly clear that there's film that this happened. And, well, Israel's ability to keep launching air defense missiles to shoot down Iranian missiles, we know, is limited. There have been reports in the American media about stockpiles in Israel running down. And of course, there have been many, many reports now in the US media about American stockpiles of air defense missiles running down also. So, in summary, the general view that Brian Beletic is giving, at least I hope I've got this correct, is that yes, Israel did conduct a strike. Yes, that strike probably did hit, in fact, undoubtedly did hit some Iranian targets It did do a certain amount of damage, probably not as much damage as the Iranian strike of the 1st of October did on Israel. At least it didn't hit as many targets and penetrate as extensively as the Iranian strike did. But over time, if there were to be a missile war purely between Israel and the United States, purely between Israel and Iran, the balance over time would gradually shift in favor of Iran. Simply because it has a bigger industrial capacity, it's got more long-range missiles, it has a greater capabilities to hit targets in Israel, and we know that the Israeli air defenses are starting to thin, whereas even if the same is true about Iran's air defenses, Iran is a far bigger country with a much bigger industrial base, so it can absorb far more damage than Israel can do. So I think that is probably the most authoritative analysis of the Israeli strike that I have seen so far. We still have huge numbers of gaps in our knowledge, but as I've discussed in previous programs, the very fact that we have those gaps in themselves beg questions. As I said, why we're not being provided with the satellite data, the photographs, the film data, which would verify the levels of damage on Iran that are being claimed. Anyway, let's move on. The Iranians have threatened another major missile strike on Israel. So far, nothing like that has happened. They did say that they would wait for that until after the US election. The US election is out of the way. Maybe the Iranians are preparing another missile strike. We shall see. But we've now had the extra complication that the US authorities have moved forward with their allegation that an Iranian assassin was sent by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to the United States with the purpose of assassinating the man who is now the president-elect, which is to say Donald Trump. I am absolutely unable to get my head around this story. I find the whole thing absolutely and completely bizarre. I would like to see this person identified and produced. I'm not clear whether he's been arrested or not. I am completely at a loss to understand why the Iranians would want to do such a completely irresponsible and reckless thing. I do accept that there are many different factions in Iran, and it may be that someone in Iran of a very militant and reckless personality decided to make this decision and to give this sort of order. But I have to say, reading as I do the Iranian media, which has its own style and its own language, but nonetheless, I do get the sense that the people who run things in Iran are far from stupid and have a wide understanding of the realities of the modern world. And I can't help but think that they understand perfectly well that assassinating the candidate of the Republican Party on the eve of an election, assassinating the president-elect, would be disastrous for Iran. Going back to what Brian Beletic said about the ability of Iran to absorb damage, Brian Beletic did make the point that he was specifically focusing on the balance of power between Iran and Israel. Over time, the balance would tend to favour Iran. But he also acknowledged that if the United States went all in and supported Israel and participated fully in an Israeli air offensive against Iran, in other words, if the US Air Force was also fully involved, well, then in that case, the damage that would be done on Iran would be exponentially greater. Iran can absorb the kind of blows that Israel can launch against it, but it would struggle to do the same, to put it mildly, with blows that the United States and Israel might inflict. In fact, Ryan Beletic spoke about the ability of the United States in conjunction with Israel to essentially destroy Iran's energy system, to inflict massive damage on its nuclear sites, to create an enormous crisis within Iran itself, to damage Iran up to the point where the stability of the Iranian government itself might be put into question. Well, that may all be true, and again, I'm not going to argue with Brian on that. On the contrary, I think he may very well be right. So why would the Iranians want to invite that on themselves by taking the unbelievably reckless and foolish step of assassinating the Republican Party's candidate for election to the presidency, the man who is in fact now the president-elect? I say that because taking a step of that kind would frankly be an act of war, and it would almost certainly, were it to happen, attract the kind of massive retaliation by the United States that Brian Beletic was discussing. Beyond that, as I've discussed in programme after programme, going all the way back to the original Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, what we have seen from Iran is that it has bent over backwards. It has strained every nerve to avoid being drawn into an all-out war with Israel and, of course, by extension, the United States as well. Now, this is not because the leadership of Iran are pacifists. It is because they understand that a war, an all-out war in the Middle East at this time would not be to Iran's advantage. If, of course, the war involved both Israel and the United States, well, all the risks that Brian Beletic was talking about in his programme would come to the fore. There would be an enormous strain and pressure on Iran, which I personally think the government there probably would survive, though I can't be sure of that, but which would certainly inflict huge damage on Iran. Now, the Iranians have just broken out of economic isolation. They've joined the BRICS states. They're forging relations with the Russians. They're forging relations with China and, by the way, India as well. This is hardly the time for Iran to put all of that at risk by taking on itself reckless steps which could involve it in the kind of war where all of that would be thrown away and Iran itself could be smashed to pieces. So, for that reason, the Iranians have worked very hard over the last year, the year of crisis in the Middle East, to try to avoid getting drawn into an all-out war with Israel and by extension, of course, the United States as well. Their actions towards Israel, in particular, have consistently seemed to me to be more intended to demonstrate deterrence than to pursue outright aggression. Even the Iranian missile strike of the 1st of October appeared to pull punches. It attacked the Nevatim air base in the Negev desert, but even then, the total amount of damage done seems to have been less than might have been the case, given that 36 missiles apparently managed to penetrate Israel's air defenses and hit targets around that base. And also, by the way, other missiles appear to have managed to, well, one of them landed very close to the headquarters of Mossad. And again, it looks as if that was probably more intentional. It was more intended as a warning than anything else. So, given that the Iranians have, for entirely understandable, very practical, very tough-minded reasons, sought to avoid an all-out war with the United States, done so, by the way, to the point that it has, according to the Western media, created strains between Iran and some of its regional allies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the militias in Iraq, those sort of things. Why would the Iranians lose all sense of reason and decide to conduct an assassination attempt against, of all people, Donald Trump, which would quite plausibly put them in a completely disastrous position? It makes absolutely no sense to me. It is completely, entirely inconsistent with everything that we have seen from the Iranians up to this point. Now, this morning, Iran is categorically denying that it had any part in any assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Speaking for myself, I am going to want to see an awful lot of evidence that Iran really was involved in such an assassination attempt before I genuinely, truly believe in it. And up to this time, I've seen no evidence at all, just assertions and rumours. Now, just to complete this segment of this programme, I should also say that Brian Beletic did make a further point about what might happen if the United States were to join with Israel in a major air offensive against Iran. The offensive might be successful. It might do massive damage on Iran. It could conceivably even destabilize the internal political situation in Iran and destroy the viability of the Iranian government. But the price the United States would pay in terms of the resources it would have to expend, the number of missiles, the number of cruise missiles especially, the operations, the extent of the operations that would be required, and we're probably talking here about an air offensive, an air campaign that would have to be conducted at very high levels of intensity over many weeks, just to say. The amount of resources that the United States would have to expend on such an offensive would be such that it would deplete US military arsenals already, at a time when, as we've seen in the Ukraine war, those arsenals are already significantly depleted. And, well, the only effect of that would be is that it would reduce American military leverage over its major superpower rivals, China and Russia. And again, Brian Beletic thinks that obviously that would not be in Iran's interests. In the United States' interests, and it might be reason for the United States to think carefully, to weigh carefully what it might do, and to pause. Well, anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this. I'm going to say one further thing, actually, before I do finish, which is this, that if the Iranians have sent assassins to try to assassinate Donald Trump, the Chinese and the Russians will be absolutely furious with them. The Russians especially, but also the Chinese. It would certainly do major diplomatic damage in terms of Iran's relations with those two powerful countries. And that's a further reason why I simply cannot understand this entire allegation. As I said already, I would like to see evidence, actual, real evidence, that this whole plot has some reality behind it. Anyway, let's move on and let's return to the topic of the war in Ukraine, the one that's underway. And of course, over the last couple of hours, we've had lots of reports about a conversation between President Zelensky of Ukraine and the President-elect Donald Trump. And very interestingly, it appears that Elon Musk was in on the call. And what has become absolutely clear from the information that both the Ukrainians and the Americans are providing is that no commitments of any kind were made by anybody. Elon Musk did say that, for the moment at least, there are no plans on his part to switch off Starlink or anything like that for the Ukrainians. Trump went on to say that the United States continues to support Ukraine, but apparently he made no further commitments. The Ukrainians didn't get any concrete assurances, as far as I can see, of anything moving further, moving forward. And I can't honestly see that this call takes us really anywhere further than where we already are. Now, apparently the Wall Street Journal has an article in which it says that Donald Trump has also been speaking to various European leaders over the last couple of days. These are the people who are phoning him up to congratulate him on his election victory. Over the course of many of these calls, the topic of Ukraine has come up, but in not one of these calls has Donald Trump made any clear commitments at all. It's just been usual expressions of congratulations, polite words, those sort of things, but nothing of substance has been said. Now, the fact that Elon Musk was on the call between Donald Trump and Zelensky, I do find interesting, because Elon Musk, more even than Donald Trump himself, has become an increasingly trenchant critic of the war. And he has been indicating for some time that he thinks that the whole war was a mistake, that it's essential to try and find some kind of peaceful solution to the war. He's come into for a lot of criticism from many people because of it. There's been, as many of us know, especially in Europe, a major campaign organised in parts of the media against Elon Musk, all kinds of criticisms of him. I'm going to express my own view. Most of this criticism centres on his well-known scepticism about the war in Ukraine. And I can't help but think that Elon Musk is indicating by the fact that he's in on the call that he's going to take a direct interest in this, in any discussions within the Trump administration about how to bring the war to an end, and that his involvement in the call was intended to signal to the Ukrainians that he is, from this point on, going to take an active role in formulating the administration's Ukraine policies. So I think that is important. Now, Musk has made certain further comments. He's spoken about the fact, he's made statements to the effect that the war is indeed coming to an end, or at least the United States' involvement in it. And I've seen a report which appears to originate in Newsweek that he has also indicated, or at least the report indicated, I'm not sure that this came from Musk himself, but the report that I've seen which discussed Elon Musk's comments, anyway, it indicated that these ideas that had been floating around, the freezes of the war, Ukraine being asked to put off its NATO membership bid for 20 years, and for British and French and Western Europe troops to be sent to Ukraine to patrol the buffer zones and all of that. Anyway, this report appeared to say that that was nonsense. As I said, I'm not sure whether the word nonsense came from Elon Musk himself, or whether the commentator who was discussing Elon Musk's role is the person who is telling us that it is nonsense. But it is nonsense. That whole proposal is nonsense. And I'm taking this report as an indication that there are people in the United States, in the administration, in the pending Trump administration, who thankfully recognize that fact. Anyway, I say all of this, I think, to understand how much nonsense that idea is, and to also get a sense of the actual realities in Ukraine. It might be as well at this point to actually discuss in a little more detail than I have been doing recently the actual military situation on the Ukrainian battlefields, because I have been fully absorbed talking about the election and Donald Trump's victory, and I've only spoken about the military situation very sketchily. So I'm going to do what I hope will be give a relatively short account of it, going from north to south. But before I do, I wanted to say something else, which is that the Ukrainian officials, and I believe this comes from the Ukrainian General Staff itself, ultimately from Syrsky, are saying that the Russians have just added another 100,000 men to their forces in the conflict zone, and that they have further extended the front lines. Now, about the extra 100,000 men, I believe that that is probably true. It is consistent with the steady increase in the size of the Russian army, which has been taking place since the autumn of 2022. In the autumn of 2022, in September 2022, Putin called up 300,000 men. That was a mobilization of men who had recently served as soldiers, as has now since become clear. It was not a tapping of wider Russian reserves. But since then, since that first mobilization that took place in the autumn of 2022, starting from the first weeks of 2023, the Russians have been busy calling up soldiers and recruiting more and more soldiers and volunteers on a contract basis. And we've at various times heard reports that the Russians have been increasing the size of their military at a rate of around 30,000 men a month. And this has been continuous throughout 2023, which would mean, by the way, that the Russians recruited a further 360,000 men over the course of 2023, and it has continued through 2024, except that we are hearing some reports that the total number of recruits has somewhat fallen in recent weeks, that the Russians are now recruiting perhaps around 20,000 men a month, less than the 30,000 men a month of a few weeks ago, but who's to say what the exact numbers are. Now, just to say in parenthesis, over the course of his Valdai speech, speech and press conference, Putin disclosed that the total labour shortage in Russia is around 2 million people. 1.5 million for the construction industry, another 500,000 for manufacturing industry. That's a significant number, that there's a shortfall of around 2 million people. Now, we can see that the recruitment of men into the military is playing some role in that. But overall, the major reason why there is the shortfall of people in the civilian economy is because the economy has been growing faster than the available resources. The very point that Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, has been making. And I've discussed in various programs how the only real way to deal with this problem, at least in the short to medium term, is to recruit workers from outside. And over the course of the speech and press conference, Putin seemed to again indicate that Russia was in fact willing to accept workers from outside, that all that they needed to do was abide by the local laws and try to learn Russian, and that the Russians would accept that. So I suspect that over the next few months, the Russians will make attempts to try and recruit workers in Central Asia again, and we will probably start to see the flows of workers from Central Asia resume over the next few months. Anyway, that's one thing. The other thing is, and I do really want to return to this, there's been a huge amount said about the 10 or 12,000 North Korean soldiers who are in Russia, or supposed to be in Russia. In terms of the total size of the Russian army, which must now be approaching around 1 million men, this is a drop in the water. But to that must be added information that North Korean workers are now being recruited to work in Russian factories in the Far East initially, in the car manufacturing sector, the auto industry specifically. And of course, North Korea does have a pool of workers, both in construction and in manufacturing. And I suspect that that is the major priority for the Russians at this time. We're probably going to see many more North Korean guest workers in Russia over the next few months. And I suspect that that, together with workers from Central Asia, is going to be the way the Russians are going to try to address this labour shortage. But anyway, put all that aside, the point is that the Russians have significant forces that they can use in Ukraine, and the figure of 100,000 extra troops that the Ukrainians are telling us about is entirely plausible. Now, there are lots of rumours about where these troops are going to advance. There are reports, there are rumours that the Russians are preparing a major offensive in Zaporozhye region, that they've deployed large numbers of men in this area. In fact, we know that group of forces Dnieper, commanded by one of Russia's most capable commanders, General Teplinsky, numbers around 130,000 men. They've not really been heavily engaged in the war for many, many months. It's entirely plausible that they could be thrown into battle at some point, maybe over the course of the winter. There are suggestions over the last couple of days that the primary objective of the Russians will be the large settlement of Malaya Tokmachka, which is a small town just southeast of Kurakhove in central Zaporozhye. Malaya Tokmachka and Kurakhove itself were, of course, the forward bases from which the Ukrainians launched their doomed counteroffensive of the summer of 2023. The distance between these places, Kurakhove and Malaya Tokmachka, and the forward Russian positions north of the village of Rabotino, which the Russians recaptured some months ago, is, I believe, something like 5 or 6 kilometers over basically open steppe land. So an offensive in this area is a distinct possibility. But the Ukrainians are also talking about the Russians having extended the front line. And that suggests to me that these additional 100,000 Russian troops who were probably, by the way, recruited in 2023 and who have only now completed their training programs, these additional Russian troops are probably being located somewhere else. And a reasonable location, a reasonable guess, is that they are being located in the north, along the Ukrainian-Russian northern border, and that they are being prepared for a possible offensive, maybe in the direction of Kiev. That seems to me more likely. It could be the General Teplinsky, who has more than enough forces at his disposal in the south to launch an offensive on Kurakhove and Malaya Tokmachka, and ultimately towards Zaporozhye itself, is going to launch an offensive in the winter. But it could be that the Russians are also preparing a further offensive in the north. But anyway, the Ukrainians have to worry about that. Their army is already very depleted. They're short of men and short of machines. Group of forces north is saying that in the Kursk region, the Ukrainians are now very short of armoured vehicles. They've said this again in their latest report, that the Ukrainians are very short of armoured vehicles. I'll read the latest report. This is from the last summary. In the unsuccessful counterattacks of the Ukrainian armed forces, we again see practically only infantry. Most of the armoured vehicles were destroyed by Russian missile men back in the Sumy region. The rest are scattered along the roads and plantings of the Kursk borderland. So that's what Group of Forces North say, that the Ukrainians, even in the northern areas now, are very, very short of armoured vehicles. They're short of men. We've had multiple reports about this. Mariana Bezuglaya, the Ukrainian MP, the dissident Ukrainian MP, has recently visited the training centres of the Ukrainian military. She's very depressed by the shortened training programs and has heard many criticisms from the trainees about the way in which they are being trained. Anyway, Ukrainian army is short of men. There are reports that Western militaries are now cutting back on the time they're giving to the Ukrainians to train because of the urgent need to try to fill the gaps in the front lines. So the Ukrainians are short of men, they're short of machines, the Russians are piling on more men and more machines, and they're doing this all the time. And their air force is increasingly active, and I spoke many months ago, as I remember, about the fact that the Russians might start using powered glide bombs, that they might start attaching jet engines to the glide bombs to increase their range. Now, apparently, that is starting to happen and is becoming visible in a big way. The bombs, these new glide bombs, are called Grom, thunder bombs, and the Russians are using them increasingly. So we can see that the military balance continues to shift steadily in the Russians' favour. But what exactly is going on the front lines? So let's start with Kursk region. Firstly, over the last 2 days, the Russians have launched a significant offensive there. Yesterday, Group of Forces North said that the Russians had advanced 12 kilometres. Today, they're claiming that over the last 24 hours, they advanced a further 2 kilometres. Group of Forces North are saying that several villages were captured by the Russians 2 days ago. There don't seem to have been more villages captured over the last 24 hours. But all of the reports taken together tell us the same thing, that the Ukrainians are straining to withstand the Russians in the area of the fighting in Kursk region. And again, Group of Forces North, in their very latest report, say that a total of 417 Ukrainian servicemen are in captivity. I have noticed that nobody is talking about this, but it does look as if the Russians have taken a lot of prisoners captive in the area, in the fighting in Kursk region. Now, Radovka, the Russian newspaper in Smolensk, said that on the first day of the latest Russian attack in Kursk region, the Ukrainian defense proved very disorganized, that the Ukrainians found themselves unable to move easily because of the marshy, swampy conditions, and of course the roads are dominated by Russian drones. The Russians, therefore, were able to gain ground very rapidly in Kursk region, and that there is now a real possibility that a significant number of Ukrainian troops are cut off in various places, especially in the northern area of what remains of the Kursk pocket. And I suspect all of that is true, just to say. So, what the Russians are doing is that they're operating a death by 1,000 cuts. They know that the Ukrainians are committed to holding out in Kursk region. They continue to pour men and machines, to the extent that they have any machines, into the Kursk pocket. The 47th Mechanized Brigade, the brigade that was used to fight in used to fight in the Zaporozhye offensive, the offensive of last year, and then trying to hold back the Russians near Avdiivka and then west of Avdiivka and all of that. They're now also there in the Kursk region. But what the Russians are doing is that they're not, it seems to me, trying to destroy the pocket in one fell swoop. They're slicing off with each attack parts of it, rounding up the Ukrainian soldiers who get trapped. And we heard that they've taken 417 prisoners in the last offensive. And gradually they're shrinking the pocket until all that's going to be left is Suja itself and perhaps a few villages around it. And then I suspect that they will finish off, not by launching a direct attack on Suja, but by encircling the remaining Ukrainian troops who are located there. And this makes complete sense because the Ukrainians continue to send their best troops and their best machines, what they have left of them, to try to hold the Kursk pocket. And this makes no logical sense. And from the perspective of the Russians, this is the best thing that can happen, that the Ukrainians deplete what reserves they have to try to hold on to this increasingly weak and useless ground. And if 100,000 Russian troops are being gathered in this area over and above the troops that are already there, well, we can see that the Russians, once the Kursk pocket is extinguished, would indeed be in a very strong position to launch an offensive of their own into northern Ukraine. So that's what's going on there. Now, there is a very complicated battle going on along the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. It is clear, the one thing that is clear to me about this battle, and this is a confusing battle because the Russians have been fighting to capture various villages and settlements along the eastern banks of these two rivers. And what they've been doing, again, is that they've been conducting a death by 1,000 cuts type strategy. Rather than knock out the Ukrainians entirely from the eastern banks of these rivers, they have been slicing up the Ukrainian defenses. They've been isolating the Ukrainians in small pockets, which they then encircle, inflict more damage and more losses on the Ukrainians that way, causing the Ukrainians once more to deplete their reserves, even as they gradually pile up their forces. The Russians pile up their forces near Kupiansk and perhaps ultimately in Torske, preparing to launch what I suspect are going to be simultaneous offensives towards Liman and Kupiansk, perhaps again also in the autumn. And just to finish, I think that at that time we will probably also see a major effort to finally extinguish the Ukrainian positions in Siversk as well. This small town, which lies now well to the east of the major Ukrainian defense lines. Anyway, so that's the situation there. Now, in Chasiv Yar, further south, again, it's a confusing picture, but overall, the Russians are steadily advancing both south and north of Chasiv Yar and in the central area of this town. I'm not sure how much of Chasiv Yar the Ukrainians still control. The Russians seem to be keen to keep information about this particular area of the battlefronts relatively quiet. The Ukrainians have made a major effort to try to hold on to Chasiv Yar, but slowly, gradually, the pincers are closing, and every report confirms that the Russians have steadily gained more and more territory, both to the south and to the north of Chasiv Yar. that the communications to Chasiv Yar, the transport links to Chasiv Yar, to the Ukrainian garrison there, is being steadily cut down, and that, again, the general view is that the position of the Ukrainians in this area is also deteriorating steadily. Over the last couple of days, there have been more reports of a major deterioration of the Ukrainian forces in Toretsk, the town of Toretsk. Now, again, the most detailed account has come from Redovka. Redovka has confirmed that the Ukrainians transferred troops to Toretsk. They sent reserves there to try to not only hold back the Russians, but even to push them back. About 10 days ago, the Kiev Independent published a piece about how the Ukrainians had supposedly stabilized the situation in Toretsk. What Redovka says actually happened is that the Ukrainians did launch some counterattacks. They did regain some ground, but the counterattacks eventually lost momentum, that the Ukrainians lost more of their reserves, and now the Russians are back on the attack in central Toretsk itself, but more importantly, they are clearing up in the villages west of Toretsk and are moving to cut off again the major supply road into Toretsk itself. There was a long, interesting discussion of the Battle of Toretsk by Redovka about 3 days ago, and the Redovka is saying that the major priority for the Russians is not just to capture Toretsk, to drive the Ukrainians out of that town, but also to inflict on the Ukrainian soldiers who are defending Toretsk so much attrition that the Ukrainians are unable to build effective defense lines south of Konstantinovka, the major town, about 70,000 people, that lies to the north, which will be the next Russian objective once Toretsk and Chasiv Yar fall. So all of this, we can see that the Russians are advancing, but it's grinding, attrition warfare, incremental, the kind of warfare that we've seen many times play out on the Ukrainian battlefields, going all the way back to the start of the Russian offensive in October last year, when the Russians were pursuing the strategy which I've described as aggressive attrition in Kursk, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk. It is aggressive attrition still. In southern Donbass, it is different. There, the Russians have broken through, and they are moving very rapidly. In fact, it is becoming very difficult to keep track on all that is going on. And one of the difficulties is that we're getting so many reports that it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell what is true and what is not. Now, to give one example, there is a report circulating, what looked like to be pretty secure report circulating, that the Russians have captured around half of Kurakhove itself, that there's only some areas of Kurakhove which the Ukrainians are defending, that the Ukrainians have set up a rearguard force in the western part of Kurakhove, and that the Ukrainians understand that Kurakhove is lost and are preparing to retreat from that town. Now that seems astonishing because, of course, Kurakhove was seen as the great linchpin of the Ukrainian defences in southern Donbass. After the fall of Ugledar, it was the place which the Ukrainians were likely to defend. It's difficult to encircle because it is on the southern banks of the Kurakhove reservoir. We were hearing all kinds of reports about how the Russians were pushing up incrementally through the various villages to the south of Kurakhove and were working to move round Kurakhove from the north. And now we're getting reports that the Russians have come very close to actually capturing the place. And this has all happened just within a couple of days. Now, I think some words of caution are necessary here. Similar claims were made in August and early September about Selidovo. The Russians did, of course, eventually capture Selidovo, but I can well remember that there was a time shortly after the Russians arrived in the area of Selidovo. There was a time when it was widely assumed that the Russians were already in control of around 40% of Selidovo. And, well, it turned out that, in fact, those reports were probably overstatements of the facts. The Ukrainians rushed troops to Selidovo and stabilized the situation there. And the battle took many more weeks than those initial reports said. And I wonder whether we're going to see something similar happen around Kurakhove, because it does seem remarkably rapid collapse if this is really true. But put that aside, we are getting lots of other reports about what's going on in the Kurakhove area, and all of these reports point to a very rapidly deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians. The Russians, it seems, it's now conclusively confirmed, captured the village of Vovchenka to the north of the Kurakhove reservoir, another village, Stepanovka, to the west of that. They're now fighting in another village called Ilinka, and that probably will fall. And it's suggested that the Ukrainian troops there, maybe several score of men, are effectively surrounded. The Russians have also captured the villages of Novodimitrivka and Zoria further to the north. There are reports that they've now entered the supposedly heavily fortified village of Sontsivka, which also lies to the north. Elsewhere, east of Kurakhove, they've captured Antonovka. They have, which is located just north of Bogoyavlenka. They've been pushing northward from Maximovka towards a village called Suhiyali. They seem to be moving rapidly, very rapidly, towards a general encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhove. And if the Ukrainians are indeed in the process of retreating from Kurakhove, it could be because someone in Kiev has finally understood that there is a genuine risk of encirclement in Kurakhove, and they've therefore taken the decision to pull the Ukrainian troops out before that happens. All of this, it seems to me, is plausible. So, a rapid, accelerating collapse. And going back to Brian Beletic's program, he made what I think is a point that people really do need to understand. I've discussed in recent programs that the war in Ukraine, in terms of who's going to win, is now over. The Russians are definitely going to win this war. I mean, barring some unexpected catastrophe in Russia, which is not going to happen, to say it straightforwardly, the Russians are going to win the war in Ukraine. There might be a political crisis in Germany which could bring a hawkish Friedrich Merz and make him chancellor. He might decide to authorize Taurus missiles. There might be a splenetic reaction from Donald Trump to any refusal by Putin to accept whatever ceasefire plan Donald Trump comes up with. There might be all kinds of things of that kind. But, as Brian Beletic correctly said, in Ukraine, the West, the United States, has reached the limits of its capacity. It has already given Ukraine all that it realistically can. And putting completely aside what Donald Trump may or may not do, about which more in a moment, we can in fact see that already before that, even before the election, the administration, the current administration, has been taking steps to dial the US commitment to Ukraine down. There was no meeting in Ramstein. There has been no support for Zelensky's victory plan. There's been no decision to authorize long-range strikes against Russia. And the United States has not supported, and this is the Biden administration we're talking about, the United States has not supported Zelensky's latest proposals for a peace conference. So the United States has already taken the first steps to walk away. And the reason for that is because of the constraints they've given Ukraine. Huge numbers of missiles and weapon systems. And as American reports, media reports have said, they can't start to give more. Doing more would risk the United States finding itself in a position where it doesn't have enough to act elsewhere. And it's not just the United States that is in that position. There was a report yesterday in The Guardian, a fascinating report, saying that relations between Britain and Ukraine have almost completely broken down. Keir Starmer came in as Prime Minister. He seemed to be giving Ukraine all the support he could do. He invited Zelensky to attend a British cabinet meeting. He went to Washington to lobby for Ukraine for permission to conduct deep strikes against Russia, and was then taken aback when he found that the Americans weren't interested. So there's no doubt at all that the Starmer government fundamentally wants to support Ukraine. And yet it seems that the Ukrainians are furious with the British. And the reason, according to The Guardian, that they're furious with the British is because supplies of Storm Shadow missiles from Britain have come to a stop. There's been no major attacks with Storm Shadow missiles for weeks and months. There was one small attack a short time ago, but the last major attack was back in March. Supplies of Storm Shadow missiles from Britain have effectively come to an end. And the Ukrainians are furious, and they're blaming Starmer for this. But they're wrong to blame Starmer, because it's not that Starmer doesn't want to supply Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles. It is, as the British media have in one or two places effectively admitted, supplies of these missiles are now almost exhausted. Britain doesn't have the missiles to give, nor, I suspect, does France. In fact, the only readily available stockpile of missiles left are the Taurus missiles that the Germans have, and that may be why, the main reason, by the way, why there is all this demand to supply them. So we are reaching the limit of our capabilities. And there's a interesting article in the Times of London by Max Hastings, very well-known British commentator here and military historian, very angry and upset about the fact that the West is soon going to have to make peace with the Russians on Russian terms. Anyway, very angry article. But, and he says, he has all kinds of that Putin, well, I could read the point he says, it has been obvious for months that President Putin has won his gamble to show that he is tougher and nastier than the decadent West. I don't like the expression decadent West, by the way. There may be some force to it, but that's not the reason why the Russians have won. The Russians have won because they're better organized. They have a far bigger army than Ukraine does. They have a society that is united in supporting the war. And of course, they have a far more powerful military-industrial complex than anybody in the West imagined. And anyway, Max Hastings goes on to say the European nations, amid economic woes, much influenced by energy costs, absolutely true, are desperate to get Russian oil and gas flowing our way again. They're frankly bored with Ukraine. Well, I don't know where he knows that, but that's what he says. But then he says this. Moreover, surprising people in Washington, London, and elsewhere are murmuring, why are we keeping this thing going when there is no hope of a Ukrainian victory? On Wednesday, that's to say Wednesday of this week, the day when it became clear that Donald Trump had won the election in the United States, I heard a British general say just that. And last week, an impeccably liberal commentator sang the same song to me. So, we are reaching the end of our capabilities. The British military are starting to see that. And even Max Hastings, who is able to talk to these people, he's able to talk to British generals. I am not able to talk to British generals. He says that that is what these generals are telling him. So, this is why we're going to start to see over the next couple of months moves to try to find some kind of way to get out of the war. It's because the Russians have won. There is no other reason than that. And of course, as I've discussed in my recent programs, having won the war, knowing that they're going to win, the Russians have no objective reason to make concessions. Why should they make concessions? To help us in the West save face. They show no inclination to do so, and they won't. And the sooner this is understood, the better for all of us it will be. Well, I've discussed all of this. There'll be many more things to say, no doubt, about this war. But this is where I'm going to end my program today. We will see what Donald Trump does. We will see what happens over Iran and this extraordinary story about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But this is, as I said, where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.